adore you, our Lord. Please be seated.
No? Here we go. So as you've heard, we are coming to the last couple of weeks that Robin and I will be here in the role of team leader, and then we're using up our leave until sort of the end of our 5 years at the end of the year. And wondering what to talk about, whether to pull out something that I thought was really important from the last couple of years, or whether to begin, something that might be a bit new. Was an interesting time. And there was something that I've preached before a long time ago, but not here, that I thought I would share today because it brings a slightly different angle to something that you've heard me talk about before when I've talked about the idea of seeing everything in colour, the idea of our whole lives being influenced in certain ways. And today I want to talk about the idea of having a soundtrack of your life. And I don't know whether you've ever, thought a whole lot about soundtracks, but, you used to go to a record shop. I don't know whether they even agree, Sanity's not even here anymore, whether there's still those kind of shops you can go to. They might have records, they might have CDs, or they might have QR codes to go and download your thing, I don't know. But I'm sure if you've got Spotify, you could probably get Spotify to play you, the greatest soundtracks of all time. And, there's a few examples of ones there. But, movies and soundtracks, really go together. And I don't know whether you've even thought about it, but even way back in the very infancy of movies, when you talked about silent movies, really, they weren't silent at all. I've got a little movie for you here. It's only about 1.5 minutes long, but this is a silent movie. Did she have a stunt double? Amusing. So even silent movies, they weren't silent. And if we think about movies and we think even about life, I don't know whether you've thought about it, but the soundtrack makes all the difference. The music was sort of appropriate to what was going on and added to it all. And I don't know, whether you've ever realised how much, the soundtrack impacts some of your favourite movie scenes. Oh, where's the sound? I've ruined it for you, haven't I, Josh? How about this one? That's a bit more dramatic. Still not right. that resolve things for you? Gives you the sense of the grandeur of the landscape, the momentous nature of the quest and the task. But when you're actually in the movies, half the time you probably don't really notice the soundtrack at all. You just absorb the whole story. You might look at it and imagine that that's something that you could feel yourself in without realizing that there's some music going on that's tugging at your emotions in some way or another, that's bringing some sense of melancholy or some sense of excitement and anticipation. I mean, if you went swimming and the Jaws soundtrack was playing, you'd perhaps be a little bit more concerned than otherwise. And even if you've never thought of it, you've got a soundtrack to your life. I like this quote, which I found years ago in a few places, and no one attributed it to anyone, and I can't find out where it originally came from, but it's kind of true. At its best, music provides a language and a soundtrack for your emotional and intellectual life. If the artist does their job well, they describe the world as they see it in a particular moment. Are you aware of a soundtrack to your life? Or if the concept of a playlist. And do you have a favourite playlist? If someone came to your computer and they opened your Spotify and they sort of talk in the current language, what would it come up with that was, suggested for you? And how might we go about preparing a soundtrack for our life? Well, I think one way we could do that is to turn to the Psalms. Because the Psalms really are a soundtrack from God for all of our emotional and intellectual lives. They are quite raw at times. They are real, they're joyful, they can be a bit disappointing. Sometimes they've got anger, sometimes sadness, sometimes confidence, everything in between. I don't know if you've ever really thought about it, but what is a psalm? There's 150 psalms in the Bible, in this book called Psalms, which is kind of funny because it's in the Hebrew, original language Old Testament, and we use a Greek word to title the Hebrew book from the Old Testament. Because Hebrew's psalm is kind of the Greek for plucking strings, for a Hebrew word which simply means a collection of songs of praise. And I don't know whether you've ever noticed when you've read through the Psalms, and I hope you have read through the Psalms, that it has headings. You might have a Bible that has headings, and I don't know whether you realise, but most of those headings in your Bible weren't there in the original languages. They've only been there for the last, maybe even in the last 50, 60 or 70 years. I don't know if they've even been there for a couple of hundred years, where people will put a little heading for what they think, the section is. And that can be helpful, it can be a bit of a problem. But in Psalms, there actually are some headings that weren't perhaps there originally, but have been there for a couple of thousand years. And there'll be all these little things, and it might describe the type of psalm that it is. It might talk about it being a miktam, which is simply a psalm that has a specific tune. That it might say, you might read it and it'll say, to the tune of, and it'll have, the hit tune that, you would use to sing that with. Some might be called a maskil, which is like a very meditative idea and something's going to impart wisdom. Some have this funny word called shigayon, which means just going astray. So I don't know whether that means you sing it out of tune, or some people have decided maybe, it's just like being really exuberant. So I saw something that described it as a rhapsody. And so I thought, you could have a Babylonian or Jerusalem rhapsody or something instead of the Bohemian Rhapsody, but that's not helpful. Some are interesting. There are road trip songs in the Psalms. I've got a great, road trip album on my phone. It starts with, I can't remember what it starts with now. Anyway, you probably, I should play it play it later. It starts with Don't Stop Believing, that's right. It's got a whole heap of good road trip songs. Songs of Ascent, they're called. To be sung as the pilgrims were making their journey and their way to Jerusalem. And through all these various types of psalms, of these little, sets of lyrics, of poetry, designed to be sung, to be listened to with music, pretty much the full range of human emotion comes in that. And I don't know whether you've ever thought about it when you've been in movies. You might have thought about it. You've probably noticed it without realising it. And the different, times in a movie when particular characters there or particular mood that they're trying to bring along, there'll be different themes musically that would be appropriate for that time. Is my music happening? Anyone know what one that is? Princess Leia. Yes! Not only did he know what it was, he knew what it was. Princess Leia. You know that one? That's her dad. I'm looking at Josh because I know he's going to know all these. Just run from the Lord of the Rings. And if you've watched the 3 long movies, you'll have heard, it's not just one little song. It'll come at different times when that scene's going on or when they're harking back to it. Oh, and then the Shire theme, when they're remembering, when they're longing for the good, and then when they've managed to finally achieve it all. And these different themes in movies, part of a soundtrack that, the composers are smart enough to know that they want to do that, bring them back at different times, and they build. And in a way, when you first hear it, it builds something in you with what's happening at the time. And then when it plays it again, it harkens back to the emotions of that time as well as the emotions of the time you're in now and can build on it. And, with the soundtracks of our lives, from, not just the Psalms, but, the whole range of emotions and connections that God has with us in the Bible, if we can have that build something in us and at different times in our lives and different experiences, come back to us again and again, we build that kind of a soundtrack to our life that I think can just add a great richness to our experience. It's often in the movies that have that epic scale, like Gone with the Wind or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever, that they'll have these themes because it's the whole life unfolding and developing. And in a way, when we read through the book of Psalms, we can see that, particularly as we read perhaps the life of David, and then we read the different Psalms that apply to different periods in David's life, and we can see the varying feelings he would have. And one of the great things here is that the emotions that we feel are all ones that God shares with us in some way. I haven't put all these verses up, but when there's some sense of sorrow and loss, we know Jesus understands that because we're told that Jesus wept when he met Mary and Martha weeping over their brother Lazarus' death, even though he was to raise him from the dead soon after. Where we might see struggle in our life, we can know that God understands if part of the soundtrack of our life is knowing the verses and the passages that talk about the one who is a high priest who is able to sympathize and empathize with our weakness, knowing what it is to be tempted. In times of joy and triumph, Jesus sent the disciples out and they were effective in their ministry. And it says in Luke that, they came back excited about what had happened. And it says, Jesus, full of joy, praised the Father, sharing that triumph. And on we find that it goes. That the Lord shares those things with us. And we can sing along to this soundtrack. Had a friend who loves going to musicals and started going along to all the sing-along versions of the musicals now. Probably because she started going to so many, she started singing along anyway and getting dirty looks when you weren't meant to do that. So she went to the ones where you were allowed to sing along. And she just recently went to the sing-along Mamma Mia, apparently. I don't know whether she had to wear leg warmers and whatever to be part of the audience successfully, but I think she had a great time. But the Psalms, if you've never read them, I'd encourage you to. Just an example, one here, this Psalm 89. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. To all generations I'll make known your faithfulness with my mouth. Your heavens will praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. The psalm there goes on and comes up with a verse which is a bit different in more modern translations, but when I first learnt it, I learnt some songs that went along with it, and it talked about blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. In some modern ones, it might talk about, blessed are those who know how to, sing the joyful song of praise themselves. But blessed are those who know the joyful sound. They walk, O Lord, in the light of your countenance. And thinking about this idea of soundtrack a while ago, this verse and the song that went with it kept coming to me. The idea of blessed are they that know the joyful sound, that have this particular soundtrack to life playing for them. And as I said, it might not be always joyful. It might sometimes be sorrowful when it matches the sorrowful mood that you might be in. But it stitches everything together in this tapestry of a story that does come to a resolution at the end. And whether you know it or not, I think you probably do have a soundtrack to your life. You might not be as aware of it as it would be good to be, but I would encourage you to recognize it, to think sometimes maybe, what is the tune, either literally, metaphorically, or whatever that might be going on in yourself in that experience. This is one of these other psalms, an amazing one. You've turned for me my mourning into dancing. You've removed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my soul may sing praise to you, O Lord, and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. I think I've got Psalm 31 in there. I think it's Psalm 30. I might have made a mistake in my typing. But that my soul may sing praise to you and not be silent. And as we in our own selves begin to perhaps sing along to the soundtrack of our life, be aware that people are listening. People might hear what it is that our soundtrack is. And if it's discordant, it might be worrying, but if it's one that is truly from God, it might actually have a great effect in drawing others into him and to know him better. In Ephesians, we're encouraged to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. I know sometimes people have joked that, psalms are obviously the psalms, hymns are the ones that you play when you've got an organ, and the spiritual songs are the ones you used to play with the overhead projector. But I think that maybe what it means is psalms are where we sing scripture. Hymns are where we sing something that a person has deliberately composed, and spiritual songs would just be perhaps when we spontaneously make something up on the spot out of our own joy, singing in our heart to God. And we're encouraged to have this overflow from us to those that are around us. In Colossians as well, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your heart to God. I think that the lives that we live, in some sense, become also a song or a soundtrack. We're certainly told in the Bible that the lives we live might be a fragrance to those who are perishing. Might it be that we are not an unpleasant fragrance? So I don't think it's too far a stretch to suggest that perhaps there is also a sound from our lives. This is an interesting verse. Your statutes, the precepts, the rules, the laws, the things that are said in your word are the themes of my songs in the house of my pilgrimage. Are God's statutes, are God's words to us some of the themes in the soundtrack of our life? And as I said, you can sing along. Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O Israel. I like the little picture I found there. Music is what feelings sound like. And don't be afraid of feelings. Jesus showed us feelings. He understands. And that we've got an emotional life that runs the gamut from anxiety to despair, to excitement, to anticipation, to triumph, to joy. And if you're afraid that you seem to be stuck in a life that is more silent than you'd like, if the soundtrack that seems to accompany you is perhaps the wrong one, and I pray that you can tune into the soundtrack that God is singing along to your life. I love this passage from Zephaniah. Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord's taken away your punishment and turned back your enemy. The Lord is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. Is God singing over you in the soundtrack of your life? In your playlist? I talked about how life for me was very different when I had the experience of becoming a Christian, and in the light of that, seeing everything illuminated with God's presence. And there's a sense as well that when I'm able to tune my ears in to hear the soundtrack of God singing over my life, it makes such a difference as well. I share something which I have shared here before, and I shared at my previous church, and someone wasn't too happy when I did it at one stage because I talk about a myth from Greek mythology, but if Paul in Acts can refer to Greek poets and writers as an illustration in his preaching, I think I can refer to some Greek mythical stories as well. And it's the story of the Odyssey. And there's this guy called Ulysses who was going to go on this Odyssey and this long trip. And part of that trip was having to go on a boat past a dangerous island, the island of the Sirens. These beings who would sing and play what sounded like beautiful music and lure the sailors to the rocks around the island and their death. And then the Sirens would feast on their flesh. And Ulysses knew he had to get past there, and he had a plan. He got beeswax and he stuffed beeswax in the ears of all the rowers so they wouldn't hear the music and be able to keep rowing and not be distracted. But he'd heard tell of the song being so wonderful, he thought he'd try and listen to it himself. And so he got them before he set off to lash himself to the mast, to tie himself to the mast, so that no matter how tempted he was, he wouldn't be able to move, to go. And so that's what he did. And the soundtrack of his journey going past the island was, the sirens singing their alluring song and him struggling to get free and yelling to those to, come and untie him. But of course, he'd stuck wax in their ears so they couldn't hear him, so they kept rowing. And the, wonderful end to the story is they made it safely past the island of the sirens. And sadly, that sometimes is the Christian life for many. They have something going on that is alluring and tempting, but they know it's not good for them, and so they try and bind themselves up or bind other people up with so many laws and rules and regulations and knots that they can resist it, even though they want to. And you might think, well, that's great. You resisted the temptation so much. You managed to follow all those rules and expectations, and it kept you safe as you got past the island. But there's another Greek story that involves the sirens as well. Jason and the Argonauts, boat called the Argo or whatever. He had to do the same thing. He had a better plan. He knew this guy called Orpheus, who was a beautiful, wonderful singer and musician. And if I get emotional this time, it's just because, the sweetest song is so much a better way to live your Christian life. I haven't got many more weeks to encourage you in that. But they started, and the sirens began to sing the alluring song, and instead of being lashed to a mast, Orpheus began to play and sing. And what he sang was a sweeter song, a better song, a better soundtrack, a better playlist. Doesn't matter what the sirens were doing and singing, it wasn't tempting anymore. It wasn't that they wanted to do that and resisted. They didn't want that anymore. The soundtrack of their life had changed. And I so hope that you can be Christians that don't feel you have to live by lashing yourself to the mast, but you can live by hearing the sweeter song. And the sweeter song is Jesus loving us, the Father delighting over us with his love, with his joy. I think we're often unaware of how much the background music of movies influence us. I think we're also as unaware of how much the background music of our lives influences us. And what is more, our lives and how we live them is part of the background music for those that are around us and those that are in the world. Blessed are they that know the joyful sound. Will the soundtrack of our lives, will the soundtrack of your life be one that sings of the loving kindness of God, a playlist that reveals and recounts his faithfulness, or will it be discordant? Or will it be in harmony with the one sung in heaven, the song of the Lamb? Let me pray. Lord, there's a phrase that's found quite a few times in the New Testament: he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Lord, today might we have ears to hear. As Ethan the Ezrahite wrote thousands of years ago, as we read in Psalm 89, that we would know the joyful sound. If we find it hard, help us to begin as Psalm 89 does, by finding the sound of your loving kindness, reminding us of your faithfulness to us. Even if the background music of our lives is sorrowful and sad or full of tension and suspense, give us faith that the scene will change. Help us to hear again the underlying themes of your presence, your purpose, and your pleasure. As Zechariah 3:16 reminds us, you're the God who sings over us with delight. Lord, may we live lives that as they follow your statutes, your design, that our lives would be songs, a soundtrack for others. That we might, as Paul encouraged the church in Ephesus, be people who make melody with our hearts to God. That our souls would sing praise to you and not be silent.